Alexander the Great is a very famous person known for what? Conquered everything, right? Back 300 years before Jesus, he's known for having conquered almost the entire known world. Very famous person, very wealthy person, obviously, had complete power over everything. But there's a story told about him that as him and his entourage, the people with him, were walking down a road one day, a beggar asked him for some coins, for some money. This beggar was sitting on the side of the street, homeless, had nothing, and is asking arguably the most powerful person in the world for some money. Well, Alexander the Great, he looks at the beggar for a few minutes, and he reaches into his pocket and takes out a handful of gold coins and throws them to the beggar. Now, this was life-changing for the beggar, but his staff, his servants, were shocked. Specifically, one guy who was just watched Alexander the Great throw more money than he had ever even seen in his whole life, more money than he would get for years of working for Alexander the Great, was just given to this beggar. And he said, "Sir, how could you give so much to this man?" The beggar, he only needed a few coins, copper coins, to really provide his needs. And Alexander the Great responded, he said, "Yeah, I'm sure a few copper coins would have suited his needs, but this gold coins suits my giving." And what we see clearly is that even though Alexander the Great could have given just a small amount, and it would have really helped this man still, he was king of the known world, and his generosity needed to follow that as well. So over the last few weeks, we've been going through a series called All Hands on Deck. It's a series where we look at what it means to be a church. What it means to be a church that isn't just sitting inside the walls. What does it mean to be a church that is active, that is engaged in our community, that is really following Jesus in a way that shows to the world who Jesus is? That's what All Hands on Deck is about. That's what this series is about. We've been covering a lot of topics. Huge shout out, thank you to Pastor Juan Carlos last week for preaching for me. You guys, anyone here for that? Yeah? He was awesome. I texted him at 7 a.m. that morning and was like, "Brother, I am not feeling good at all." Little did I know, I tested positive for COVID just a little bit later, so don't worry, I've tested negative now. You that were regretting sitting in the front row, maybe. But he came in and preached last minute, literally last minute that morning. It was like the Bible says, right, be ready to preach the word at any moment. Well, Pastor Juan Carlos, he did that. So he's awesome. Thank you, Pastor Juan Carlos. But we've had a lot of topics that were really powerful. I was watching online last week, and he was talking about evangelism and just sharing who Jesus is, and I just saw the response from you all, how God was moving. It was so encouraging to me. Today I want to look at a way of living that's close to the heart of God, that I believe really has the potential to impact our neighborhood far more than we know, and that's the subject of generosity. Generosity. Specifically, how is generosity a part of following Jesus? Not just like something that sounds good, but what does it mean to actually follow Jesus in being generous? Specifically, just like Alexander the Great, right? Does generosity need to look different for us? If Alexander the Great, king of the known world, is like, "Hey, generosity should look different for me because I'm the king." Like, it shouldn't just be the same giving as everyone else gives. Like, I'm the king. So when I give, it should be even more generous. I think about that for us. If you're sitting in this morning and say, "Man, I'm a follower of Jesus. Jesus has done so much in my life." Does generosity need to look different for you? Should it be something different than how everyone else gives? Does it change how you use your money, or should we be different? That's my question. So If you have a Bible, turn with me to Luke, the section of the Bible called Luke, chapter 21. Luke is a part of the Bible that tells the story of Jesus, of who Jesus is. And specifically this section, it's getting close to the end of his life. It's right before he goes to the cross. He's now in Jerusalem. He spends the last couple months of his life in Jerusalem with his followers, the people who he's training up to lead the church after he is gone. And he's in Jerusalem, and they're walking around the city. Jesus is discipling them. He's teaching them. And imagine this. Jesus and his disciples have just entered into the temple. I have a picture here of the temple. You can go over to Israel, and this is still there. A temple, the same temple that Jesus would enter. I actually have been there. It's crumbling a little bit, but it is still there. And they would walk into this space that was in the center of the city of Jerusalem, and it was the center of where people would connect with God. They would come there to worship God. They would come there to have their sins forgiven. They would come there to encounter a living God. They believed that God was present there in a different way than anywhere else. That's what we believe is true of spaces that we dedicate to God, right? Like God is present everywhere, but there's some spaces where God's presence is just felt in a different way. The Bible tells us that when the church gathers together, God is present in a different way. Doesn't matter if we're in a cafeteria and there's lockers, and gum on the floor, and, during the week, this is where kids are eating lunch. But man, there's something about a space that can then be transformed when the people of God gather together. In the same way, so Jesus goes into the temple, which would have been crowded with people. This center section is the most holy section where only priests can go, but in the outer section is where all the Jewish people would come in. There was even a section for non-Jewish people, but mostly the Jewish people would go in here, and they would worship. They would give money to God. They would give an offering so that their sins would be forgiven. They would follow what the Bible had told them to do in ways to worship God. And this was a space where Jesus is at, his followers are at. They're seeing all these religious things happening, very religious things, right, in this temple. And here's this is the story in verse 1. As Jesus looked up, he's in the temple, right? He saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. So they're like giving their offering, right? He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. And this is what Jesus said. Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth. But she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. Now, what's really powerful about this section is we see a lot of stories where Jesus is telling a story, right? And he tells a story about something, and most of the time it's a story about, to teach us something, but it's not actually a true story. It's not like what actually happened. What's powerful about this actually is happening. It's unfolding. There really was these rich people putting money in. There really was this widow. There was really Jesus standing there, and he watching this happen. It's happening, and think about this. Remember, why are the people in the temple? Right? To connect with God. Like, that's why they're there. They're in the temple. There's the space where they think they can connect with God. And then who's standing over in the corner? Not the widow, but well, yes, the widow is putting in the money, but who's standing in the corner watching all of this? Jesus is, right? Jesus is standing in the corner watching. Now, Jesus, if you don't know, he's the Son of God. God himself, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Trinity. So Jesus is God. And so who's standing in the corner watching all of this go down? God is, right? God is over here in the corner in the temple. Everybody's come to the temple to connect with God. They don't really know it, but who's standing in the corner watching? God, right? God, the very person they're coming here to worship and connect with, is standing in the corner watching, right? It's like right behind that box. Maybe Jesus is standing right now watching you, right? That's what it's like. You come here to connect with God, And sometimes we don't even realize it, but God's presence is already here. He's watching. And so standing off to the side is Jesus. He's watching, and then even though his followers can't see what's going on in people's hearts, Jesus can. He's looking at this picture of what's happening. He sees things a little differently. Why? Yeah, because he's God, okay? It's not a trick question, right? He's God. So he can see people's hearts. He sees their motives. He knows what's like the size of their bank account, apparently, right? He knows like how much they're giving out of. That's what it says. So Jesus then explains the reality of what's happening right here. He explains it to his followers. He's teaching his followers something with this example. You see, in the temple, there would have been massive boxes with a hole in it. We've got one in the back there, right? They would have had these in the center of the temple in front of everybody. So people could, just like this. They had this like box with a metal like thing on it, and people would come in and they could put their money into the box. And this isn't the day of paper dollar bills, right? This is money that is coins, metal coins. So how does that sound when someone throws a metal coin into a metal box? Pretty loud, right? What? Depending on the size, sure. But it's kind of like, at least this picture is making it look like it's a trumpet almost, right? You drop it in, it's like boom. So the more people drop in, the more noise it makes. So there'd be rich people who would come in. Why does it say the rich people? Look at that first verse. It says, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. How did he know? How do people know that these people were rich? They're just like dumping in change, right? They went to the bank earlier that day, turned all their dollars into pennies so that they can just dump more coins into this loud thing. It's sounding like a waterfall of noise, right? So it was probably super loud, super noisy. Tons of people were giving very loudly. And then the disciples were like, wow, look at how much that guy gave. And there's another guy's like, you think that's impressive? Look at this. He's like dumping in so much coins, right? And as this is going on, all the people are distracted by this, but what does Jesus notice? A widow, right? An old, poor widow. Specifically, Jesus notices that her giving was more than all the rest. Now remember, Jesus is teaching his disciples something. He's not just like wanting to say something random or just like, hey, just so you know, this is what's happening. He's wanting to teach his disciples. Anybody who follows him, who follows Jesus, he's wanting to say, hey, there's something true here that you need to know. You need to know how God thinks about generosity and giving. This is what God is trying to teach us this morning. This is what God is teaching his followers, right? He wants to show them how God thinks about generosity. What is generosity from God's perspective? Because from our perspective, you would look at that scene and we'd see something totally different. But something else caught Jesus' eye when he saw a scene of people giving lots of money in a room where tons of people are being generous. God says, no. I only see one person that's being truly generous here. One person stands out more than the rest. And it's not what we're drawn to. Something catches Jesus' eye, a widow. You know, a widow, by the very nature of that name, we don't know much about this woman, but we do know that her husband had died. And in this age, that meant a lot of things. That meant, number one, that she had no support. Unfortunately, women in this day and age were not able to really own even property without their husband's name. If her husband had died, all of her property could have been given maybe to the next male relative, maybe a nephew, a cousin, and then she would have had to rely on their generosity to still support her or not, which clearly, given how much she had, wasn't seem to be that much, right? And clearly, what she was giving, Jesus says that out of all that she has, she's given. 2 copper coins, copper coin is worth about $1 if you were to like make the equivalent of today's money. So she had $2 out of all she had, she's given $2, right? That's like all she has. And where is she? She's in the temple, worshiping God, even though she's at this low spot in her life. She's in the temple worshiping God, surrounded by people who are giving thousands of times more than her. But does that stop her from giving? That's what's interesting about this story. I think that's what caught Jesus' heart. It wasn't just her giving, but she's surrounded by so many people that were doing something so much more than her, right? So much more showy, so much more visible, something that caught everyone else's eyes, and no one would have noticed the widow in the middle of all of these people. You see, every Sunday we like to say, giving is a part of worship. We say that on Sundays. And you may not really know what that means yet, but worship is when we say, God is God in my life. That's what worship is. And that can filter out in so many ways. When we sing songs, that is worshiping. We're declaring, God, you are God of my life. When you say no to that temptation, that's worshiping God. You're saying, God, you're God in my life, not my flesh, not what I want. And even with our money, when you say, okay, God, like, I don't know how I'm going to pay this bill, but I'm going to give towards your kingdom. That is worship. That's saying, God, you are God of my life. Not myself, not my own wisdom or my own way of thinking, but you are God. That's really what worship is, and that's why worship can come out in so many different ways. It has to. It can't just be one way in our lives. Well, for this woman, apparently it didn't matter what was happening around her, all the noise or her personal circumstances. She slowly makes her way to the front, takes out $2 bills, which she only owns 3 in her whole life, right? Her whole savings account is $3 bills. She takes out 2, and she puts them into the box. You see, for someone like her, it would have been very easy to stay home, right? It would have been very easy to just maybe even come in and worship God with her mouth, but not put money in the box. She would have had every reason not to, every excuse not to, right? No one would have even noticed that she was there or not there, besides who? Who noticed that she was there? Jesus did, right? No one else noticed this old woman, right? His disciples were like, what old woman? You know, what widow? He's like, right over there. Oh, I kind of see her, but I see all the rich people more, you know. Like, it was hard for people to notice her. And that may be true of you, right? It's like, man, you have all the reasons, all the excuses why you don't need to be here this morning. You've been dealt a hard hand, or your family is crumbling, or you've had all these temptations during the week. You see, this woman had every reason not to be there. She could blame God for taking her husband. She could blame God for her lack of money, right? She could say, I'm old and poor, so I don't need to go. But what's amazing is, where do you find her? Despite all the reasons not to be there, she's in the temple worshiping God with what she does have. With what she does have. Now, not only was she worshiping, she was clearly overflowing in generosity towards God. She was overflowing, considering how much she gave. And you know what this tells me? This tells me something about her heart. It tells me that God was real for her. God really was real for her. God was God in her life. She didn't care who saw or didn't see. And it's funny because Jesus was watching, right? She was going to put God first. And as we go to define generosity God's way, this is what I was thinking about this week. This is the first question you have to answer in order to rethink generosity from God's perspective. It starts with you answering this question: who is God to you? That's what really, you may think like, aren't we talking about generosity? Let me tell you, right? Clearly it's not about just giving. But there's some part that really matters of who God is in your life that matters to God, right? A lot of people give for many different reasons. You get like a tax write-off, or, you know, you had someone help you early in your life, so you're giving just to like honor that person. But we're talking about giving God's way. What does generosity look like in the church? That's what we're trying to discern, right? We're not talking about just giving and being generous. There's lots of people who are generous, right? But what does it mean to give because God has been a part of your life? That's what we're trying to discern. So who is God to you? And this question is more important than anything else. Things haven't changed much since Jesus was standing in that temple, okay? We're still surrounded by religious people who like to show how much they love God, right? Maybe you're feeling that, right? It's like we feel like this need to somehow show off that, I really know God, and I'm going to show it by the way that I drop money into this box. Luckily, we keep the box in the back, right? If we had it up here, we might have that. People coming up and they're like, hey, everyone, about to put in my money, and everybody's just like, wow, nice job, Travis. That was awesome. Things haven't changed. We're still surrounded by people, by ourselves, our hearts, who want to somehow manipulate or show people how religious we are. And we also are the same in the way that we have, just like this woman, many excuses for keeping us from coming to God. So many reasons why we don't have to show up this morning, right? We use the same excuse. I think of, just the church is full of hypocrites. Church is full of hypocrites, so I'm not going to be a part of that. And that's my excuse for why I don't go. I mean, the widow could have probably said that same thing, right? She's like, man, look at all these rich people. None of them are helping me. They say they worship God. None of them are helping me. So I don't need to be here. This system is corrupt. The church is corrupt. So I'm not going to be a part of that. Apparently for this woman, that didn't stop her from worshiping God. Or how about God has given me a low spot, right? I'm not going to give him when so many rich people owe it to me. And we feel like, man, no one's helping me, so why am I going to worship God in this way? Or I'm tired. Right? I'm tired. I'll get you next week, God. I'm just tired this week. It's the exact same thing I see here with this woman. I mean, I really wonder what's going on in her heart. What is going on in her heart? What motivated her to still come to the temple with the little she had and still worship? I feel like how many of us would have had all those excuses and not been there, right? But again, it comes down to that question, who is God to you? The answer to that question changes everything. It's the difference between you getting up early on a Sunday or sleeping in a little bit, right? Is Sunday worth it, right? It's the difference of you overflowing in generosity or thinking in scarcity. It's the difference between worship and religion, really. In so many ways. Jesus is always about the heart. He knows your heart. He knows the games you play. He knows the face you put on when you come in here. He knows how you make sure people see you a certain way. Jesus knows all those things. But just like the widow, he's the only one also that really matters. No one else notices. No one else remembers the games that we play. But Jesus notices. You may not have even noticed him, right? He's standing over in the corner over there. He's like peeking in the doorway. And it's like, we don't even notice Jesus. We come here and we care so much more what other people may think of us. But he knows your heart. He knows your relationship with him. He knows what you've given up to be here. He knows the battles you've had this week and what it took to get through each day. He knows the struggles, the temptations. He knows what really is going on in your heart. He knows if it's real. He knows if your relationship with God is real or if it's just a game. Generosity changes based on whether or not he's real or not. That's really it. Like, is God real to you? That's really what changes. Because if it's not real, he's not really God in your life. You may believe he exists, but he's not God of your life. And instead, some sort of twisted version you fall into. I was thinking about that this week. There's two things that I see all the time that kind of twist generosity for us. One of them is comparison. There's a story that Jesus tells in the Bible about 3 different amounts of money that are given to 3 servants, right? The master gives 3 servants 3 different amounts of money, 5, 2, and 1. He gives 5 bags of gold to one guy, 2 bags of gold to one guy, and 1 bag of gold to the other. He comes back, and the 2 that were given the larger amounts, 5 and 2, have invested their money, and they made back like almost double what they had. It's like 100% gains, right? And so the master is so pleased, he says, hey, I'm going to give you some more stuff to be in charge of. You've done such a great job with what I've given you, so now go and be in charge of all this more things for me. But the guy was given 1 bag of gold, just 1 bag of gold. He buried the money, and he gives it back to him. He doesn't even waste it. He gives it back to God, and he says, I know you're kind of a hard man, and, I was kind of worried what you'd do if the investment messed up, and you really didn't give me that much anyways. You gave these guys 5 and 2, so clearly you didn't really think that much of me anyways. So here's your money back, God, right? That's who he is, and the master is in the story. Here's your money back. And God says, oh man, you wasted the opportunity I gave you because you're so obsessed with what everyone else had. You're so obsessed with trying to justify why you didn't have to use what I had given you. So because of comparison, this man loses out on the blessing, right? God had given him something to use, but he ends up just squandering it, just wasting it. Comparison. You see, so many times that's how you and I are. We look at what we have, we look at someone else has, and we say, God doesn't love me. If he loved me, he would have given me what Tysonia has. No. Well, Tysonia is looking at someone else and saying, man, if I only had what Christine had, my life would be so much better, right? All of us, it always looks like someone else has it better. They have more, they have it easier. And so because of comparison, it makes God look like he's unfair. He's mean. That's what the servant says. He says, I knew you were a hard man, so I didn't do anything with what you gave me. And so many times that's why we think. Man, you're unfair, God. Look what you gave everybody else but what you gave me. So because of that, I just know you're an unfair God. You're mean. So I'm not going to do anything with what you've given me. And he wastes the opportunity that God has given you. The other 2, they were generous with what they had. They invested it. They used it for God's kingdom. And then when God came back, God gave them even more. Think about that. How many times are we clutching the little that God has given us so tight? And God is just like, all right, clearly I can't trust you with anything more. We're so obsessed with what others have that we miss the opportunity to use what God has given us. Comparison, it rots us out from the inside. The second thing that I see that keeps us from being generous is expectation. Similar but different than comparison. Comparison focuses on what others have, but expectation focuses really on what we want for ourselves. It doesn't have to be what someone else has, but it's like a dream we have for ourselves, right? We expect of God that he's going to do this for us. God, if you're really all powerful, then I expect to have a husband by the end of this year, right? Or God, if you're really all powerful, I expect to have a house. I expect to have a working car. I expect to have an iPhone. I expect to have my nails done every week or a Starbucks every day, like Juan Carlos. You hear that last week? He's like, I get Starbucks every day. I'm like, dang, bro, I didn't know you were that rich. Okay. I don't know how you can afford that. Okay. I want to have my hair cut every Thursday, whatever it is. That's my expectation of God, of how generous he needs to be in my life. So we put these expectations on him. They're not necessarily bad, but they're an expectation of how you think God has to treat you. And when that doesn't happen, you see God as not really, he doesn't really love me. He's not really all powerful. God's not able to really do this. And really God's like, hey, I'm actually like trying to redirect your life into a way where you can find real worth, real meaning in your life. But you're so obsessed with this dream that you've told yourself for so many years in your life, like that is what you need, that you are missing what I have given you. So expectation, so many times, it holds us back because we have the wrong dream for our lives. We have this dream that we've written out, we've visualized, and when that doesn't happen, we say no to God. Comparison, expectation. I mean, there's probably so many more, but those were the two that stood out to me this week as I was just like contemplating what holds us back from really surrendering to God. And that's why this question is so important. Who is God to you? Is he really God? Because if he's really God, that changes your expectations. That changes how you view what he has given you. And that's why this is the first question to generosity. Right? This is what guides everything. This is how you see God. Because to this woman, God clearly wasn't any of those things. Right? Despite having lost her husband, despite having little to live on, God was still worthy of her time and worship. To this woman, God was good. God was generous. God loved her. She clearly believed that God had given her everything that she had. And she clearly trusted him. And because she believed this, it was overflowing from her life. That's why before we even talk about what it means to be generous, it starts with your relationship with God. I could tell you like principles on budgeting and how you need to make a plan so you can give. And I'm not saying that's bad. That's great stuff. But I'm talking about what does it mean for us as Christians, as followers of Jesus, to be different than the world. And the real core to that whole thing is there's God in the picture. There's really generous, let me say it again, there's really generous people out there that don't follow God. But what is the difference for us? It's that God is in the picture. That at some point in your life, God has given you more than you deserve. At some point in your life, God became real to you. At some point in your life, you recognized he was real. So let's just talk about generosity for just the last couple minutes. You see, generosity from God's perspective is a little different than what you and I think of, right? Remember, Jesus standing, he's watching all these rich people dumping the money, Luke 21. As Jesus looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. So he's watching. It's something you can tell. It's obvious. Remember, people dumping the waterfall of coins, right? It's going in. Well, what stands out to Jesus and touches his heart is he saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. And this is what he says. Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. Now, how can Jesus say this? Clearly, the rich people are putting in way more. Right? But Jesus says, she put in more. And all the disciples were probably like, all the followers were like, what are you talking about, Jesus? Like, that does not make sense. This woman clearly did not put in more than everyone else. And they're like, wait, look at Judas here. Judas is just dumping in money, right? Over on the side. And then Jesus explains. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. You see, we view generosity way different than Jesus. If there's a huge fundraiser, they're just going to create let's just say New Life Rogers Park. We do a huge fundraiser here because we're going to buy a building, right? Now, who gets to put their name on like the side of the wall? Right. Someone who gave a lot, right? Someone gives $10,000. We're like, you get a brick with your name on it in the wall forever, right? But what happens to grandma who gave $10? Like, $10, grandma? Come on. That's how we view generosity throughout the whole world. Like the names that are on buildings, the people who are recognized. You ever see like nonprofits, they got like silver diamond status. It's the people who give like 25,000 or more. You're like, oh, wow, okay. You know, this gold status. And then the very bottom, it's like, thank you for all the others who have given, you know. Jesus seems to say that we have it wrong. From his perspective, that's not how he views generosity. Generosity from God's perspective asks this question: how much does it cost you? That's the question that matters to Jesus. How much does it cost you? Something moved Jesus' heart, and it wasn't the amount, it was how much it cost this woman. You see, you can have $1 million in your bank account, and then you come in and write a check for $10,000. May not cost you that much. You may not even notice. You have someone who actually is like on staff for you to give money, right? There are people, that's their job, is just to give money away, right? For your foundation. It doesn't really cost you that much. Now, again, is that bad? No, I'm really glad that people are giving lots of things and they're helping people. We're in like one of the most generous moments in history, right? Throughout history, that has not been the case. There's a lot of really good things. So I'm not talking bad about that. What I'm saying is from God's perspective, what is generous, though? For him, it matters a lot more the person who has $150 in their bank account and then gives $100. That's crazy. Even to us, that's crazy, right? It's like, okay, God, I'll get you later. I don't got that much, okay? Like the guy over there I saw, he gave $10,000. I think you're fine, right? Jesus is like, no. That's not what I care about. I care about your heart. Am I real to you? And if so, are you willing to give even when it costs you? Am I still first? And I know this messes with us. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's easy for me. Right? Even as a church, we like to be all budgeted up, like, right? My wife and I use a budgeting app so we make sure we don't overspend, especially like one I remember it was like 5 or 6 years ago. Corey actually told us about this budgeting app. So we plugged it in for a month, found out we were spending like $300 or $400 just on like coffee shops or something. I was like, okay, clearly we have a problem. So we started using a budgeting app every month. We go over our budget and we make sure we actually spend what we want to spend, not just by accidentally spending, right? So it's been super helpful. It's allowed us to actually be more generous. We've been able to give more than we ever have because we're actually in control of what we have, right? Now, so I'm just saying, budgeting is good. Some of us all really need the budget, and we've done a class once in a while just to help, which is a helpful tool, and we can definitely do that again. But here's the question. More importantly than just the budget, the bills, the little leftover that we got a piece maybe, right? That whole picture isn't really what I see in God's heart right here. God is saying almost like before the budget, before you plan your bills and how you're going to make it all work, where am I? Yeah, that is the question. Jesus say because otherwise it doesn't really cost you much, right? You can budget everything, make sure your bills are, and you make sure you were able to pay Netflix this month and Spotify and Amazon Prime, right? And then, okay, God, I still have $2.50 left, so I'm going to give you 50 cents, okay? Because I still need $2 for like my little splurge over here, I'm going to get a double cheeseburger, Like that's how we view it, right? We kind of budget God into this little box, and God is like, oh, what really impresses me more is when you first say, you're first. I don't know how, but I might need to cancel Netflix this month, right? You can do that, by the way. You can cancel Netflix, right? It is a month by month, unless you already paid the year up front. Don't cancel then. You're out of the money. So, but it mostly, you can not spend the money on the restaurant next month. But sometimes we just make the priorities, and that's what Jesus sees. Jesus is standing in the corner, and he's saying, oh, you say that I'm your God, but I see really where my place is by how you worship me. Being generous in God's eyes, generous from God's perspective, means it costs you. And it costs us a lot because it means we don't know if we're going to get everything else we want. We're going to have to rely on God to somehow provide for the day in, day out. Right? Even Jesus talks about it. He's like, hey, don't worry about tomorrow, right? Don't worry about what you'll eat or what clothes you'll have. Francis Chan, he was talking about this. He's saying, only in the U.S., we don't even have to worry about those things. You don't get free clothes tomorrow and there's enough food soup kitchens throughout the city. You could go get food for free every single meal this week. Only in the U.S. Most countries do not have that option. What Jesus said we don't have to worry about, we don't even have to ask God for anymore. We can just ask the government, right? We can go just get or nonprofits, right? We can go get what we need, our actual needs. But our wants, that's when we start to wrestle with God. But God, I want the American dream, the lifestyle. I want all the subscriptions, right? I want to have the fancy new thing. I want to look like everybody else. And I'm not saying any of those things are wrong, but I'm just saying Jesus, he's saying, hey, if you want to worship me, it's going to cost you. Means maybe some of those things don't happen. And being truly generous in God's eyes, if you're gonna shock God, because that's what happened with Jesus. He's like, whoa, look at this guy, look at that, right? All the other people are dumping in money, and God's just like, I don't see anything, right? It doesn't even bother him. Then he's like shocked by this widow who puts in $2. If you want to shock God, if you're going to be generous as a Jesus follower, it's got to cost you. That's what this story says, right? There's a famous story in the Old Testament. King David. You all heard of King David? Say, King David. One more time, King David. There we go. I'm just waking you up a little bit. You're getting a little tired. So, King David made this huge mistake, and because of it, there was this horrible deaths were happening throughout his whole kingdom. And so he found out in order to stop the deaths, he had to make this sacrifice on top of this certain hill. So he goes up there, he finds out the hill is owned by this other guy named Aruna, and he says, hey, I want to buy this hill from you because I need to do this sacrifice and this worship to stop all the deaths from happening. And the guy, he's like, don't worry, King David, you can have the hill. I'll give it to you. I'll give you my cattle here so you can make the sacrifice, and here's some wood even. You don't have to do anything. I'll do it all for you. And what does David say? No. Look at 2 Samuel. He says, no, I insist on paying you for it. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing. Why would David say this? Right? David is known as a man after God's own heart, right? He had a really messed up life, right? He made a lot of mistakes, but he knew God's heart. So much so that, thousands of years before Jesus, he said the same exact thing, right? He's like, no. I can't worship God if it doesn't cost me. That doesn't mean anything to God. It doesn't move God's heart. David knew that God's heart is not moved by the size of your gift. It's the sacrifice. Yeah, it's the cost. And why is this true about generosity? Why is this the key as we as Christians? I was thinking about this week. Why is this true? Why is this how God has created us? Here's the key, Hebrews 11. And without faith, it is impossible to please God. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. What's the key? Faith, right? The key for generosity to actually move God's heart is faith. And in order for it to be out of faith, it means you can't see the whole picture. You don't know how God is going to provide your bills. You don't know how God's going to make sure you got that thing covered, or, you're going to pay for school, or you're going to pay the rent. I'm not saying you go, a lot of times we can't pay the rent because we just bought pizza every night for the whole week, right? Or we don't know how to go to the grocery store. You've never actually been to one, right? Uber Eats every night, right? A lot of times we can't pay the rent because of those things. But what God is saying, like, what if by faith you give to me first in my kingdom and then watch what I do? Right? Only one time in the whole Bible does God say, test me. He says, test me in this, that if when you give to my kingdom, I don't overflow in your life and provide what you need. Only time that God says to test him. Now, if you got a full bank account, you're saying like, man, I got $200,000 in the bank. Okay, God, I can give you $50. Maybe that takes a lot of faith for you. Maybe you've never given money to God before, okay, but that's awesome. But how about the person, in comparison to the person that has faith, if you only had $200 in your bank account? Maybe it takes a lot more faith to even give anything to God at that point, right? God wants to see how much you trust that he is really number one in your life. That you believe he's actually God. He's actually in control. That's what generosity starts to actually move things in the spiritual realm. That's what I think of. What's the difference between us and just any other person that's generous? Well, number one, God is real in our life. And then when we give sacrificially, it moves that God, that same God, to do incredible things in our world. That's the difference. That's why a woman who gives 2 small coins could actually be making more of an impact than the person dumping in a whole huge thing of money, because God was moved by her offering. Think about that. Remember, it comes back to, is God real? Because if God's real and he's shocked by your giving, he's saying, oh, watch, now I'm going to open up the floodgates of heaven on your life. That's the difference. That's the real difference. Suddenly someone who had almost nothing could be making the biggest impacts because of God is walking with them. One last story here. I was reading a story about this young person who comes to this pastor and he says, Pastor, I want to build this business. And if God will bless it, I promise I'm going to give 10% of everything I make to his kingdom. And the pastor's like, oh, that sounds like a great deal. Let's pray for that. So he prays, and, as the business is starting out, he's only making $40 on his business each week. So he gives $4 every week. Well, a few years later, he comes back, and he's saying, Pastor, I think you need to let me go from this deal we made, right? My business is now making $50,000 a week, right? So, I'm having to get, how much? How much is 10%? $5,000 a week? Yeah. Pastor, I don't want to do this deal anymore, right? So the pastor's like, well, I don't know if you can go back on your deal with God, but let's just pray that God would make your business go back down to $40 a week so that you can continue to be faithful, right? Sometimes our faith will lead us to places where God will bless us, but can we keep up then with it? Right? Do we all of a sudden stop having God as the one in charge? Last thought I want to leave you with. What does this type of generosity do to Rogers Park? We've been touching on that, circling around that, but that's what this series is about, right? All hands on deck. How did walking with Jesus actually change our neighborhood? How does it change you as a person, as a follower of Jesus? How does it change you, your family, the way you live, our community here? What is generosity if we were actually overflowing generosity? How would that change our community here? Then even more so, how would that change Rogers Park, Chicago? How does God-sized generosity work hand in hand with Jesus? Why is it worth it? Why is this type of generosity worth it? We've talked about a little bit of just I really believe that if you give sacrificially, the Bible tells us that God is going to move in powerful ways, not only in your life, but in those that are around you. But here's another thing besides that, which we've talked about already, but here's one thing that came to my mind. Generosity helps people see Jesus. We pray a lot that people would discover who Jesus is, because we believe he's good. He's given purpose to your life. He's given you answers when you were in doubt, or he's brought you through the hardest season of your life. And a lot of people have a shadow in front of their eyes where they can't see Jesus the way you do. We're surrounded by thousands of people who don't know this Jesus. Maybe they know Jesus instead as a political figure. Maybe the Jesus as a certain cultural person, historical person, or maybe someone who, has a lot of baggage, things that have been said and done in his name which were not what he intended. But not very many people have encountered the real Jesus, the Jesus that we're talking about right here. And I think, what does generosity do to open people's eyes? People see ordinary every single day. Ordinary is you accidentally went on the crosswalk too soon, so the person is cussing you out, flipping you off as they drive by. That's ordinary, right? In Chicago, at least. Just me, I just get cussed out all the time. That's probably true, just me. Right? Or, waiting in long line and your kids, they're screaming and everyone's looking at you really annoyed. Like, that's ordinary, right, for you. Or people hurrying by, even though you just dropped all your stuff and no one's going to stop to help you. That's ordinary. I have all my own bills to pay. There's no way I can do anything to help you. That's ordinary, right? Unfortunately, that's more true of us in the church than I'd like to say. We're so busy with our plans that we miss what God wants to do. There's not really a change between the church and the rest of the world a lot of the time. So people, when we say, oh, Jesus is so good, and they're just like, I don't really see a difference. When we say Jesus has been so good to me, but then we treat the cashier horribly because your sale price didn't ring up. Or customer service because your Amazon package didn't come on time. Or the way you treat that person as if they're not a person, right? Whether you like it or not, you are the picture of Jesus to your friends, to your neighbors, to your coworkers. What are they seeing? If I were to ask your neighbor about you, would they say, oh, yeah, I've seen Jesus through them? Or would they say, I had no idea. That person followed Jesus. Oh, that's cool. That's cool. I don't see any difference in their life. I want to just invite the worship team up. Just read this story as we close. It's in the Bible. Another true story about Jesus. He was sitting at dinner with these religious people. They're all sitting around eating, and this woman who comes in, verse 37, a woman in that town who lived a sinful life, learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisees' house, at these religious people's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. This woman had clearly been transformed by Jesus, been seen when no one else would. Even the texts say that a woman who had lived a sinful life, that's all she is known as, shows up. But Jesus had changed her. And the Pharisee, the religious person, the person who was supposed to be close with God, who had invited him to dinner, he saw this and he said to himself, if this man were truly a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. And Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. And he tells him a story. 2 people owed money to a certain money lender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Now, Simon, the Pharisee, says, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. He says, you've judged correctly. And he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet. Because at that time, very gross outside, dirty, so the normal thing would have your feet washed. That's like the bare basic hospitality. He's like, Simon, you didn't even have my feet washed. But she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven as her great love is shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. I think this is the power that we have to show to the world the generosity. And it starts with how much Jesus has given to you. It all circles back to how you see and know Jesus. That overflows outwards. Do you know that you've been forgiven so much in your life? Have you forgotten that? Have you never received that? It overflows. If it's true in your life, people are going to see it. This woman stood out for her love for Jesus. It was crazy. It was crazy generous. It shocked people. And because of it, Jesus is like, man, this woman's sins have been washed clean because of how much she loves me. When you're generous with your time, with your words, and yes, with your money, it shocks people. They see something different. What has happened to this person? They see that you've been forgiven much. That's what I think of. Would you stand with me as we close here? I just want to invite this space up here to be